So we're going to dig a little deeper now into the White House reaction. We're going to bring in Ben Tracy at the White House. Ben, the president and his press secretary say that he was not briefed on this bounty allegation, but there's some reporting that he at least received one written brief. It's also been reported that the president's not really big on reading and prefers, oral presentations, if you will. But, how are they reacting to this information that, the information was made available to him?
They're pretty much not reacting to it. We have asked directly the White House for a response to some of these new reports that the president was given at least one written briefing on this topic, which could have been either earlier this year or the middle of last year. So far, the White House has not responded. What they're sticking to is their version of events, which is that the president was never personally briefed on this intelligence about these Russian allegations. That's the phrase that the White House press secretary used yesterday. They're clearly being very careful with their language. The White House press secretary was asked directly, was this information ever in the president's daily brief? And perhaps he just didn't read it, and she did not respond to that. So they're giving themselves room here that this could have been in his PDB, and perhaps he didn't read it or it wasn't briefed orally to him, so he was not made aware of it.
Ben, in your report this morning, for CBS this morning, you mentioned and you had a series of sound bites from Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary, in which she repeats over and over again that there was no, quote, consensus from intelligence officials about this allegation. Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican of Nebraska, has released a statement where he says, quote, who knew what, when, inside the administration? Did the commander-in-chief know? If not, why the heck not? What's going on in that process? So describe to our audience the process of how the president is actually briefed on intelligence. Do you need consensus? Do the folks out in the field who get this information, who gather this intelligence and run it up the chain of command, do they need consensus before this information is presented to the commander-in-chief, or can there be competing views, different points of view and perspectives that are then presented to the commander-in-chief for the commander-in-chief to make a command decision?
It can go both ways. From what we have heard from members of the intelligence community is that obviously they would prefer there be some consensus because that is what would make the intelligence actionable. But sometimes there is not. And if something rises to a certain level of importance, you would think the president would want to know, here's what one part of the intelligence community thinks and here's what the other thinks and here's why. If for no other reason, just to be informed, because that might inform his decisions about how he's dealing with that country or that potential threat. In terms of how the president is briefed, for instance, he has a briefing today, an intelligence briefing at 3 o'clock this afternoon. The president prefers those to be done orally. There has been a lot of criticism of kind of how he handles those briefings, most recently from his former national security advisor, John Bolton, who has said that the president very easily loses attention and that he often talks more than the briefer does, and that these have become kind of exercises in futility, in his opinion. So the president will have one of those today. The question, though, as to what rises to the level of bringing this to the president's attention, you are now hearing bipartisan questions and concerns saying something of this importance should have been told to the president. So either there was a failure to bring it to his attention, or perhaps they did bring it to his attention and we're just not getting the full story.
Ben, sorry, Anne-Marie, just one question.
Topics.
Ben, are you hearing... Sorry, just Anne-Marie, I just want a quick follow-up on that. Ben, to your last point, Ben, are you hearing from your sources that perhaps people are afraid or concerned or worried about approaching the president with something of this nature, specifically as it relates to Russia, given the president's relationship with Vladimir Putin, that there's some apprehension perhaps in the West Wing about bringing some intelligence that may compete or conflict with the president's favorable view of Putin?
I have not been told that directly, but there certainly is some speculation that given the sensitivities around Russia and some of the ways the president has responded to issues involving Russia in the past 3 years, that perhaps there would be that sensitivity. But I think that's very different from some of the president's political advisors and the folks in the intelligence community. These are people who do this for a living and are very committed to what they do in intelligence work. So to say that you would have people like the DNI or the National Security Advisor or the director of the CIA not want to bring something of this importance to the president because they're afraid of how he might respond to it, I'm not sure there is evidence of that at this point.
All right. Ben Tracy at the White House for us. Ben, we didn't even get to talk much about the pandemic and the coronavirus, 125,000 Americans dead, the curve rising sharply across the country, specifically in the South and in California. But certainly we'll talk to you and the rest of the press corps a little bit later about that. We appreciate your time. Thank you, Ben.